points changes are coming, and the top armies are quite likely to be reined in. Let's talk about the 10 units in 40k that you guys are most keen to see cut down from their lofty height. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about points changes once more, and we'll be going through a top 10 of some of the strongest units in the game that are likely to pick up nerfs in the new update, a bit of a rogues gallery of some of the nastiest threats that you can see on the other side of the table. This video is a bit of a counterpart to the previous one where we talked about which units needed to be buffed in 40k, as Games Workshop have recently announced that Chapter Approved will be having some free digital points cost to download, hopefully making some of the weaker stuff in the game a little bit stronger and some of the strongest stuff a little bit more in line. A few people have posted rumours that some of the top factions are going to be hit fairly hard in this and really shake up the game and have a new state after this. Generally I do tend to find it more interesting when there's a bit of change, and hopefully a lot of factions have the option to compete for the top spot, which hasn't really been the case for quite a while in 9th edition. With that in mind, I'm going back to the community post where I asked for your votes for all the units that should be changed. In this video we're going to talk about all the ones that you think should have been put up, and we've organised them into a top 10 of the units that most need addressing. Obviously, with just a community vote like this, there are some limitations. You're likely to get people talking about the most played armies and the most used units, and the things that are likely to attract attention are things like core units that make up entire battle lines, or really big centerpiece things that are very destructive and kill a lot of enemies. You're perhaps not as likely to get as many calls for nerfs for things that are quietly undercosted, maybe things that buff enemy units, or do less glamorous roles really well. Arguably though, at least for making people happy, these are some of the biggest threats in the game at the moment, and I have a feeling that out of this list, Games Workshop is likely to rebalance the points on more of them than they don't. In any case, let's jump straight into it, and clocking in at 10th place on the vote we have the Tyrannid Zoanthropes. These floating bug brains come in at 50 points per model, usually fielded in units of 3, though some people field them in slightly more, and they're very tempting to have in a Tyrannid list just in general, as they allow you access to that Synaptic Imperative which gives you a turn of army-wide invul saves, 4+ for monstrous creatures, and it does make them a lot harder to shift for a bit. Otherwise, in general, they're just quite a nice battle line unit, floating along and blasting out the mine bullets. They get a really big buff to casting Smite, so often they might well just be throwing out a Super Smite for d6 mortal wounds, plus an extra mortal wound for each guy in the squad. For 150 points for a decent amount of mortal wounds and being fairly tough to take out with invul saves, they are really quite potent. Also, probably in the same boat is the Neurothrope, who they're often paired with. Just in general, Tyrannid Psychers are very strong indeed, and I feel like a few points on the Zoanthropes and the Neurothropes wouldn't really make them into bad units. In 9th place is quite an interesting pick for the Scarab Occult Terminators, pretty well arguably the strongest unit in Thousand Sons by quite a way. They absolutely love Armour of Contempt and can slog up the board in an immovable phalanx, scoring objectives with their objective secured. If you're playing Thousand Sons, it does become sort of tempting just to take a massive amount of these guys, using stacking durability buffs like -1 to hit and -1 damage from a stratagem, plus maybe even healing them with their Aspiring Sorcerer upgrade or maybe Cult of Time. Just in general though, they're enormously hard to shift, Armour of Contempt combining with cover and maybe even All Is Dust as well for extra saves against damage 1, all of that does make them into a very tanky unit, and for only 40 points each. If you focus on them with some psychic buffs and things, then their ranged presence can be quite good as well. Prescience to hit on 2s, reroll some characters, +1 strength on the bolters, and +1 to wounds can mean that you're dishing out a lot of pain at AP -2. And when they do catch up in melee, a whole load of strength 5 attacks at damage 2 will make a mockery of some units, though they will struggle against some harder targets like damage -1. Finally, to get them where they need to be, you can use movement tricks like Cult of Duplicity to teleport them about, or Temporal Surge, and it does help get them around one of their major weaknesses of being fairly slow. They definitely can be an annoying unit to fight, though I will say that Thousand Sons aren't exactly one of the dominant armies right now, and likely if they're going up a small amount for internal codex balance, you probably want to bring down other units on the codex too. Things like Zangors, Magnus and the Demon Engines are all great candidates, and it will be quite nice to have them not feeling quite so overwhelmed by the Terminators. We're staying with the Psychic once more in 8th place, which is the Tyrannid Maleceptor at 170 points for the unit. It's kind of interesting that the Maleceptor is still scoring this high, as it was toned down in the recent FAQ, basically being able to theoretically cast 4 spells including its action, to going down to 2 and basically halving its mortal wound potential. Maybe some of the votes were a bit of a hangover from that, but I still think it's a pretty hefty and very efficient unit at 170 points. It's very tough for the cost at 15 wounds, toughness 8, with a 3+ save and a 4+ invul. Generally it'll be casting 2 powers, probably with a Neurothrope 3d6 and pick the highest buff, as that means that you trigger Psychic Overload for the extra mortal wounds very easily. It's quite common that this thing will be belching out 10 mortal wounds per turn at close range, maybe averaging around about 7 or 8, accounting for some bad luck, and what's more, many of them ignore line of sight as well, so they can blitz enemy units that are hiding where they think they're safe. Additionally, if it's out of range, the psychic powers can just be used to buff other units in the Tyrannid army, and you do have the option of using its psychic action to protect nearby bugs from incoming enemy fire. Still, blasting out that amount of mortal wounds on a tough monstrous creature is really quite serious for that kind of cost, and what's more, it's not even like it's completely useless in melee either. It's got 2d3 damage attacks, and if you want yet more mortal wounds out of it, you could use that impact hits mortal wound stratagem in combat, as it does have the Horned Chitin keyword. Despite the FAQ, it's still a very common pick in Tyrannid armies. Probably doesn't need to go up by all that much, but I wouldn't be surprised if it did see a further nerf. Voted 7th on the list was everyone's favourite Shuriken Hoover, the Eldar Dire Avengers, a 12-point per model elite's choice that really seems to be very strong despite moving there from the troops, and is actually a decent damage dealer unit now, as opposed to being the rather sad actions and objective holders that they were before. With 3 shots on their Shuriken catapults or the AP-2, they are very solid shooting now, and their Exarch can even dual wield guns for good measure, with a Bladestorm stratagem for exploding 6s for 1 CP. In normal terms, that will usually do a bit of damage to just about anything, with the extra AP on 6s for shurikens, but they're perhaps one of the single best units in the codex for amping up with their various buffs. Doom and Jinx will absolutely ruin a unit with shurikens, guide for reroll hits, or maybe even mobile fighters disembarking from transports, and potentially if you are going full shurikens, then you could go for a Hail of Doom custom craft world, maybe even with masterful shots. Hail of Doom is the one where 6s to hit also auto wound on 6s, so it's amazing for all the extra AP it gives. 10 Avengers for 120 points, plus a supporting Farseer for Guide and Doom, all in the Hail of Doom craft world, average something like 17 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. Pretty crazy out of at least a reasonably cheap squad that's mainly got anti-infantry weapons, at least on paper. As well as that, they are pretty fast for infantry, being Eldar. They can do actions while firing, and can get Obsec via an Exarch trait if they want it, and they can even have some annoying mobility after they've shot, either using battle focus to move, shoot, move, or fire and phase to hide behind terrain. In general, I think they are pretty strong in just about any craft world, but maybe the serious powerhouse one is the Hail of Doom craft world attribute. I think at least some people would argue that if you want to rein in shuriken spam out of craft worlds, it's probably that craft world attribute that needs adjusting, and not the points cost for the individual shuriken units, which might be a bit more underwhelming in other craft worlds. In 6th place we come to the Winged Hive Tyrant for the Tyranids, 205 points for Adrenal Glands, and one of the scariest HQ choices around when it's wielding its favourite bone sword. It's strong enough to be justifiable just on its pure melee stats alone and speed, I think, but it is also a leader beast in itself as well, giving you some rerolls to one unit through the Synaptic Web, and also casting a couple of psychic powers, either for some more mortal wounds or things like advancing and charging. Then with the Adrenal Glands, it's got a pretty crazy 17-inch move and can still charge, and typically people seem to quite like giving this guy the Reaper of Obliterax, the relic bone sword that gives a mortal wound for every successful wound roll, a whole ton of damage 3 attacks, plus you can use the Adrenal Gland stratagem for an extra D3 attacks in a pinch. Then, to absolutely add insult to injury, you could potentially rip an enemy unit to shreds, and then use the Overrun stratagem to move 17 inches and hopefully get as safe as possible from enemy retaliation, either behind terrain or maybe behind some Tyrant Guard. In general, I really wouldn't be too surprised if the Winged Hive Tyrant did go up a bit, though the regular walking one also did attract a fair few votes as well. I think maybe he's a little bit less showy, but he is significantly cheaper and does decent shooting as well as melee. In 5th place we come to the Tau Storm Surge, a walking battleship with a really big gun and 340 points with the Pulse Blast Cannon. I'd argue that it's probably not the single most problematic unit that Tau can bring at the moment. We'll get on to them, though I think it perhaps particularly draws attention to itself, as compared with just about every other super heavy in the game, barring maybe Knights, it's just massively superior. The thing is that even if you do compare it against Knights, if you roll well with this thing and use the Borkan stratagem, then you potentially could be losing a 24 wound Knight in a single turn to it with pretty much no counterplay. It certainly makes it hard for knight players to feel too favourable about this thing either. In terms of strength, it's just very tough for the cost. 22 wounds at toughness 8 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul isn't going anywhere fast, and it just brings a massive amount of very big scary guns, 2 big strength 16, AP -4 and damage 12 shots, plus missiles, destroyer rockets, smart missile systems, and some other secondary weapons like flamers if it wants. Depending on how much you have to move this thing, you could potentially have it hitting on a 3+ and re-rolling all hits if it's stationary. A marker like buff really isn't all that hard to acquire for something this big, though if it does have to move to get in threat range, then its mobility can be fairly decent with Montcar. 8 inches plus d6 advance should get you fairly far up the board. It's quite an advantage that it won't be locked in combat as well. If the enemy tags it, it can just walk away and still fire. And as I mentioned, it's really quite a nice one for the boar concept as well. 2 CP to ignore invuls with that stupidly big gun, it's going to near enough guarantee that you're deleting major threats from the board each turn. I think it's maybe one of the units that attracts more attention just because it's a really big scary thing in the middle of the army. I'm not sure I'd necessarily rank it above other big firepower sources like hammerheads and broadsides, but there's no getting around that it's decently strong. In 4th place we have Mr. High Lord of Terror Trajan Valoris himself, 160 points worth of undercosted Powerhouse HQ, a Custodes unit that was absolutely great when the Codex dropped, and then mysteriously dropped 10 points because Games Workshop seemed to think that he wasn't strong enough already. Point for point, he's one of the single strongest HQs in the entire game, I think. He fights well, is very tough, and has great command abilities. In melee, he'll do you 6 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3. He's got 8 wounds at a 2+ save, 4+ invul, and a feel no pain. He'll give your nearby Custodes reroll 1s to hit and wound, often all that they'll need, and his Moment Shackle special rule either will allow him to fight twice, ignore an attack, or auto-interrupt, all of which are great options in the right situation. Finally, he'll typically be your Warlord, allowing you to reroll hit rolls and get a bigger heroic intervention. He gets some command point refunds, plus gives you a starting bonus CP, which looks like it'd be no bad thing going into Warzone Nephilim. I guess that's another decent advantage of him. Compared with the other shield captains, you don't even have to spend command points to set him up. He just does what he does and is awesome. I really would not be too surprised if he gets a fairly significant increase in the chapter approved points changes. Before we get into the top 3, I thought we'd just do a few honourable mentions for the other top voted choices that just missed out on the top spots. First up, Sisters Repentia attracted perhaps a surprising amount of votes, considering they're kind of mid-tier at the moment. I guess there's no getting around that they're one of the strongest units in the Codex, very strong melee with decent AP and damage too. Plus you can make some long charges with the Repentia Superior plus some miracle dice. I feel that most people who were saying that they should be nerfed a bit were probably saying that other Sisters units should be buffed as an alternative. I feel like they could still be good with an extra point or two on them, and cut some costs on a lot of other things in the Codex. We've mentioned a few Tyranids already, and we're not done with them, but other NID units that attracted attention were the heavy support Tyrannifex and Carnifex, both of which are monstrous creatures with big stats and are very mighty for how many points they cost. The Tyrannifex can have some very nice firepower with the Rupture Cannon, and is really quite tanky. Carnifexes are very flexible and core. Perhaps the Screamer Killers and the Venom Cannon / melee builds are both very strong. For the Tau, Hammerheads and Broadsides both drew some votes, not quite enough to make them onto the list and a bit less than the Storm Surge, but I'd argue that they're probably fairly similar in power to the Storm Surge. The Hammerhead has its scary railgun that can punch through invul saves innately, and Broadsides still have some of the most efficient anti-tank fire in the Codex, and sometimes it's handy to have a unit just sitting around and not needing to be buffed by other things. They did lose core recently, which certainly toned them down. Finally, for the Craft Worlds, another unit that drew attention were Swooping Hawks. Their Skyleap allows them to bounce around the board, smashing through the enemy chaff with mass las blaster fire, then redeploying themselves somewhere hopefully completely safe, where they can just jump out with their good movement and do it again. I think they're very rarely going to be a bad unit for Eldar to include, as they'll be able to give you essentially a few turns of kind of free damage dealing, and then late game maybe pivot to be a bit more of a utility unit, being a bit bolder and contesting objectives, or jumping around to do actions. Baharoth is pretty much in the same boat here, jumping on and off the board, decent damage when he's on it, and can swipe objectives with his OBSEC as well. Finally though, let's get into the top 3 units, and in 3rd place we have the Tyranid Harpy. This Menace of the Sky is 170 points with the heavy venom cannons, and I'd say it's hands down the best flyer in the game at the moment, and it's not even close by any way, shape or form. Just listing out all its advantages do take quite a while. Its anti-tank firepower is good enough to carry the unit just by itself. 6 strength 9 and damage 4 shots are great. It backs that up with 8 anti-infantry shots at strength 5 AP-1 as well, plus a bomb attack with around 2 to 5 mortal wounds per turn for something that it flies over. And usually it's going to be getting that damage on exactly what it wants to, as it's a flyer with great movement. Then, just in case you weren't impressed with that enough, it's also tougher than most flyers, with 13 wounds at toughness 7, plus -1 to hit as per normal. It's more mobile than the majority of them, with multiple pivots per turn. You've got the option of dropping spore mines around to be annoying if it can't get anywhere to fire the bombs off, and you've got the option of dropping it into melee as well if you desperately need to tie something up, or deal a little bit of damage in the assault phase. Then of course you can support it a little bit. You could upgrade it to Synapse if you wanted, which is very nice in Leviathan, Dermic Symbiosis for a 4+ invul, or Voracious Ammunition for basically 3 mortal wounds more or less whenever it fires. Then finally Codex Tyranids has some very decent monster support stratagems, such as Transhuman for 1 CP, or Mortal Wound Impact hits. Basically with these kind of stats, including a pair of Harpies in a Tyranid list is rarely going to be a bad choice. They're so dangerous that they absolutely need to be dealt with, and as early as possible, and they're tough enough to take some serious firepower while the rest of your army gets to work doing what it needs to. I'd argue they're perhaps one of the most obviously undercosted units in the whole game at the moment, and their points could easily go up by a fair number and they'd still be good. It seems that we're sticking with our all-consuming overlords when we get to second place as well, as Tyranid Warriors were the unit that got the second amount of votes out of the entire list of units in 40k. Again, these guys are great, 25 points per model before we get to upgrades. They're dangerous, have decent support options, and interestingly can either be used as fairly cheap chaff or big expensive damage dealers depending on how you field them. If you compare them to similar units in other people's codexes, then it's rare that you'll see things compete in terms of the stats that you get for the points. The default loadout at the moment seems to be Bone Swords and Death Spitters, decent AP2, Damage 2 melee, and a bunch of Strength 5 AP2 shooting. Enough to be annoying at range, and very scary in melee against the wrong unit. As they're 25 points per model and can be fielded in 3 model squads, they're also one of the cheaper Tyranid troops choices too. Termagants only save you 5 points and don't really do as much damage, so they're quite tempting to take there. They're Synapse creatures, which is nice to have in the battle line just anyway, and they also have a good synaptic imperative, allowing the entire army to get exploding 6s to hit in melee on a crucial turn of combat. If you did want to build around them as damage dealers, you absolutely can. Big squads can be a nice choice for the various character command abilities, things like the Tyranid Primes or the Hive Tyrants buff will go down well. They're points intensive enough to make good use of stratagems, and the Adrenal Glands and Toxin Sacs upgrades both seem really quite undercosted if you're applying them to an enormous 9 model unit. You're only paying around 3 points a model if you take both. Finally, just for some more options, you can choose to include some Venom Cannons to give them a bit more ranged bite, and they synergize very nicely with some of the competitive Hive fleets. Leviathan would give them transhuman physiology, Kraken would give them better mobility, and Behemoth would give you better melee might. Overall, they're just a really solid troops choice, and I wouldn't be surprised if Games Workshop puts them up something like 5 points. Realistically, I think that the datasheet isn't really all that well designed. Some of the weapon options are just a bit on the underwhelming side, and they're not too well balanced against the Bone Swords and the Death Spitters. I think in an ideal world, the Death Spitters and Bone Swords would just cost a few extra points each, but GW really does like to keep things in multiples of 5, and I think that this is one datasheet that makes a bit less sense because of that rule. I think just increasing the Death Spitter and Bone Sword options would go a fair way to fixing the unit and making it a bit less oppressive. Finally, last but not least, we come to the highest voters unit. It seems that Tau Crisis Battlesuits are the single unit that most people want nerfed in all of 40k. I can see why these guys were voted for quite so much. Currently, in the pecking order of 40k armies, Tyranids seem to be on top, and then I'd argue that Tau are a fairly close second, not really all that far behind. They did suffer some nerfs recently between barrage changes and a few rules tweaks, but the main powerhouse unit that remained largely unaffected are the Crisis Suits, and it just shows some bad internal balance in the codex if a lot of people are choosing to run entire armies of almost nothing but Crisis Suit spam. I think that most people would agree that it's important for these to be good within the Tau Codex, but I feel that there's still probably room for them to increase points, and for them still to be a very attractive option. Typically, Crisis Suits are around 45 to 60 points per model, depending on exactly what guns you load them up with and whether they take shield generators. You often see them operating in bricks of around 5 or 6 of them, maybe with a few attached drones as well. Their raw firepower is quite good, they're probably behind some of the other gunline units, but what makes them truly great is that they're a core unit with a massive amount of synergies available, plus they're really quite fast and can get that firepower just where it needs to be. It makes them hands down the best firepower unit in the Tau Codex in my opinion. Their guns are quite well balanced, and just about every single gun that they can take I think does have a decent niche. Probably the plasma rifle stands out as the single strongest, particularly with a lot of high save 3-wound models about at the moment, but I think that you can make a case for literally all of them, whether it's the long range of the missile pod, the extra anti-tank of the fusion blaster, or even the ignores line of sight of the airburst fragmentation projector, though they're certainly weaker after barrage changes. Then stack a perfectly tailored squad with excellent synergies, the great commander buffs and rerolls, stratagems that affect a really big meaty unit, and in particular that reroll wounds warlord trait for squads up close, and their damage output just becomes a massive hoover that deletes units off the board. They're pretty fast at 10-inch movement base, can get even faster with Montcar with advancing, they can deep strike if they need to, or a Cold Star commander could give them an even further advance if they wanted to do that. As it goes, they're fairly safe from melee, they can just sit there and fire in melee and they'll have great overwatch, plus they've got their -2-inch to charge stratagem which can cause issues, so they don't fear melee as much as some of the other Tau units. For outwitting opposing gun lines, they can move, shoot, move with a stratagem, so some of the longer range squads in particular could jump out of the terrain, blitz the enemy, then jump right back in and stay hidden. And even the squads that are out in the open can be fairly tough to kill. Ablative shield drones can be very tough to remove for the cost, cover saves on iridium armor can go up to a high level, you can get a feel no pain from the prototype system, and at 5 points per model they can all have 4+ imballs as well from shield generators. Overall, I think they're actually really quite a good choice to have a small points nerf for. I think that they still want to be a core unit and have access to all those synergies, but maybe going up 5 points base and a little nerf to the plasma rifles as well, I think might have them in a bit more of a better place. A unit that's still going to see a lot of play, but also isn't going to just completely oppress the rest of the Tau Codex, so you don't see the rest of the choices as much. In any case, I'd be kind of amazed if they got through this balance pass without going up in points in some way. So anyway, I think that just about brings us to the end of this video. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you agree with this ranking? And which units in the game at the moment do you also think might need toning down? I'll certainly be reviewing the chapter approved points changes in full once we get them, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all these videos a lot, I would just like to quickly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find a link to down in the video description. Making quite so much 40k content every day does take really quite a lot of time and effort. If you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is enormously appreciated in keeping all the videos coming. I do try and give some decent reward to people who support the videos. You get to see certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. Feel free to check it out if you're interested. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.